I'm very pleased to introduce Kevin Anderson. Kevin teaches sociology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. The title of his talk tonight, Marx at the Margins, is the title of his book, which will be out early next year and is being published by the University of Chicago. I look forward to that. There are lots of handouts here. Well, two, but many copies of them. Would someone be kind enough to... Thank you. So Kevin has been nice enough to give us a rundown of his talk here, and then a sheet on who are the Marxist humanists. Kevin wrote the Rosa Luxemburg Reader. He's co-editor with Peter Udis, and he wrote some time ago Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism, which I myself found an absorbing and very important book. So without further ado, Kevin Anderson.
Hi. What's going around are two things. The first one is, I don't have PowerPoint. I don't know if this place has it either, but it's just like it'll help you to follow some of the points in my talk. And then the other one is a sheet about a website that a lot of my writings appear on. This talk may even appear on that website in a little while, as well as some other writings related to my book. Now, what you're going to get tonight is an exploration of some of the issues in the book Marx at the Margins, and so it'll try to look at it as a whole briefly, and then afterwards, whatever issues people are interested in, we can explore in greater detail. Okay, despite the revival of interest in Marx, especially since the economic crisis hit a couple years ago, despite that, as we all know, or the room would be much larger, that conceptual barriers continue to block what I think would be a very positive step, returning to Marx as the primary source of leftist critique of modern capitalism and of modern society as a whole, and also for the battle for change. In this sense, I think what Jean-Paul Sartre said several decades ago still holds validity, which is that as long as we live under capitalism, Marx will still be an essential thinker to look at, and we won't be able to really transcend his critique of political economy until we transcend capitalism. But in the last few decades, especially since maybe the 1980s, there's been a lot of critique of Marx, a lot of discussion of Marx being dead, or Marxism being dead, and they fall into two main sets of critiques. One, of course, is the familiar neoliberal critique that Marx is a dead dog because he tried to take us beyond capitalism, to which there is no alternative. And the experiment of the Soviet Union failed, or it is said as part of this critique, thus invalidating at an empirical level, at a factual level, Marx's supposedly impractical and utopian schemes for society, for socialism. But most of us don't, I doubt too many of the people here travel in those circles. So the circles we travel in, a different kind of critique of Marx appears in progressive academia, in the intellectual left. And this critique of Marx has taken a second, fairly different direction, although with some overlap. Here it is said very often that the problem with Marx is not that he was too radical, but that he was not radical enough. Some add that the truly radical thinkers are people like Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, even Friedrich Nietzsche. These critics, most famously Edward Said, author of Orientalism, attack Marx for adopting what they see as a unilinear unilinear model of development in the modernist mode. Postmodernists have termed this the grand narrative. Here, much of the debate has revolved around Marx's early articles on India and China during the early 1850s, and also in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, a passage on China. At a more general level, it is said even more often among progressives that Marx informs us about class and economic structures and economic crises, but that his theoretical model does not incorporate race, ethnicity, or nationalism at all, or at least not very much, or not very successfully. So I think responding to these critiques, especially the one coming from the progressive left, is very important. I think it's as important as the earlier effort to separate Marx's original vision from Stalinism and other forms of totalitarianism. And that effort is still necessary today, but those questions have kind of faded. Now, we inhabit a culture saturated with negative images of Marx, even on the left to an extent, and it's therefore impossible to approach his writings for the first time without being affected by some of the definitions already in place from the critics. And in this presentation, I want to mention and respond to the types of criticism of Marx that have been coming from the progressive left and which center on charges of unilinearism and grand narrative, and which also which argue that Marx is burdened by ethnocentrism and lack of concern with race, ethnicity, can't conceptualize, it said, issues like nationalism very well. And here we should, before getting into Marx's writings, I want to talk for a second about Marx's life, because the title of my book comes out of this notion of Marx being at the margins. Marx himself lived at the margins. And his thought is, of course, relegated to the margins so often. And the deconstructionist philosopher Jacques Derrida captured this very well in his book on Marx about 15 years ago. He wrote that he noted that Marx lived as a political refugee in Victorian London, and Derrida linked this to his equally marginal position within the Western intellectual tradition as follows. Marx remains an immigrant among us, a glorious, sacred, accursed, but still clandestine immigrant, as he was all his life. So part one of this talk is called Marx and the Non-Western Other, India, China, and Russia. I think I want to acknowledge at the beginning that Marx's critics do have a point in terms of some of his early writings on India and China. Marx begins with a somewhat modernist and unilinear perspective toward China and India, but moves gradually toward a more multilinear and multicultural approach toward India and other non-Western societies in the following years and decades. As Edward Said and other critics have noted repeatedly, Marx's 1848 to 53 writings on India and China exhibit Orientalist notions of modernity, occasionally accompanied by ethnocentric ones, in which European colonialism is portrayed as a necessary stage on the road towards social development for societies trapped in an unchanging traditionalism. He begins to alter this perspective, I will argue, in the late 1850s, particularly in the Grundrisse and in his writings on anti-colonial resistance in India and China. By the time of his late writings, 1879 to 82, some of them still unpublished, Marx has moved toward a more anti-colonialist position and a more multilinear approach to social development, in which certain pre-modern social forms, especially communal property, are seen now as building blocks for an alternative form of modernity. So let's trace some of this evolution, but beginning with some of the more problematic part at the beginning. In the Communist Manifesto, as is well known to Marx's critics, Marx and Engels write famously in praise of Western capitalism penetration of Asia, of its, quote, battering down of all Chinese walls and of its drawing even the most barbarian nations into civilization. This is in the first few pages of the Communist Manifesto. Here Marx and Engels seem, one, to view Western colonial incursions into Asia, including England's first Opium War against China of 1839 to 42, as on the whole progressive and beneficial in that they undermined Oriental barbarism, as they called it, and brought modernization in its wake. Second, they assume that the rest of the world would sooner or later follow in the footsteps of the more technologically advanced Western European nations, especially Britain. You could picture it as a train, if you wanted to, with Britain in the lead car, and then these other societies way in the back being dragged along into the future. Marx and Engels praise this early stage of capitalist globalization in the manifesto. In a way, I think it can be seen as part of their overall sketch of the achievements of capitalism in Western Europe and North America, which you also find on the first pages of the Communist Manifesto. Now, in that case, when they're talking about modern capitalism, it's followed by a withering critique of capitalist exploitation, of its incessant economic crises that call its very existence into question, and so forth. But when they get to India and China, they don't follow the praise of colonialist progress with a critique of that sort in the Communist Manifesto. It's just kind of left hanging. Instead, they hold to an implicitly unilinear model of development in which China and India would become like Europe eventually, and then they would have these contradictions and they would be able to progress in a more positive socialistic manner. Now, Marx continues these themes, and now it's Marx alone, in the writings around 1853 for the New York Tribune. In some passages, of course, Marx evokes notions of an independent India shaking off the chains of British colonialism. But even here, there's still the notion that India has to be modernized along Western European lines, and that this is inevitable. Moreover, Marx's portrait of Indian culture and society is so condescending that it's painful in the 21st century to quote some of it. So I want to just give you a sense of this. Here, following Hegel, he describes India as an unchanging society that lacks any real historical development except, he says, those introduced by its conquerors, whether the Arabs and the Persians or later the British. In the face of these conquerors, he writes, India proved to be an unresisting and unchanging society. And he does not mean that as a compliment. The roots of this are said to lie in India's economically self-contained villages, which stifled individual development and social progress. In fact, Marx portrays the communal structures of these traditional villages as, quote, the solid foundation of Oriental despotism. While he also begins to attack what he calls the barbarism of British colonialism. In other words, here it's a equal opportunity barbarism. Both the British and the Indians are barbaric in different ways. He still views colonialism as bringing about necessary, if painful, progress through modernization in a rather unilinear fashion. 4 years later, in 1857, he begins to shift his position on India and China. By 1857, the anti-British Sepoy uprising broke out in India, which led to 2 years of conflict in which the British almost lost control of the subcontinent. Marx enthusiastically supports the uprising, noting that the rebellious Sepoy troops, who were British-trained Indian soldiers, that's what we're talking about here, were themselves a product of British colonialism, and he does so in a typical kind of dialectical formulation. He writes, there is something in history like retribution, and it is a rule of historical retribution that its instrument be forged not by the offended but by the offender himself. And for the next 2 years, Marx continues to write in the New York Tribune, and he and Engels describe the Sepoy uprising and its brutal suppression by the British. And he in fact, not only does he celebrate the Indian uprising, but he contrasts it to the relative quiet in Europe with the labor movement and the socialist movement at that time. And he writes to Engels that with the collapse of the labor and socialist movement in Europe in the late 1850s, India is now our best ally. In other words, the best source of rebellion and possibly revolution against the global system. By this time, he has assumed a more anti-colonialist position, of course. Marx has also shifted his attitude toward China by this time, strongly supporting the Chinese during the Second Opium War, which is 1856 to 1860. And this begins with one of these kind of things where supposedly a British flag was taken on a ship, so therefore they basically pulverized the city of Guangdong, or Canton as it was called in English then. When Marx writes, the unoffending citizens and peaceful tradesmen of Canton have been slaughtered, their habitations battered to the ground, and the claims of humanity violated on the flimsy pretense that English life and property are endangered. These sweeping assertions are baseless. The Chinese have at least 99 injuries to complain of to one on the part of the English. So as with India, Marx has moved toward a more anti-colonialist position by, this is 1856-57, with China. Now this is the same period, 1857-58, that Marx composes the Grundrisse, the Foundations of Political Economy, it's sometimes called, and also his first published book, with his critique of political economy, The Critique of Political Economy, 1859. Now, these books contain a revision or reworking of his earlier conceptualization of three successive modes of production: Greco-Roman or slave-based, number one; medieval European or feudal, number two; and modern bourgeois mode of production, number three, based on free wage labor, formerly free wage labor. Now, referring mainly to India by now, Marx inserts another mode of production alongside these. He calls that the Asiatic mode of production. And what he suggests here is that pre-capitalist Asian societies were on a different trajectory than the European development from the ancient Greco-Roman slave-based society to the feudal mode of production. And from then on, Marx contests the notion that we can use the word feudal in some kind of uniform sense for pre-modern, pre-capitalist societies. He confines that to Western Europe pretty much from then on. Also, while he talks about Asiatic societies and their structures here, he's less negative. I mean, he certainly continues to be critical, and he doesn't become a romantic, he doesn't want to go to India and become a Hindu or anything like that, or Buddhist. But he is more appreciative of these societies and their cultures and civilization. And also, he says that this communal property and communal structure of the village could take either a democratic or a despotic form. So this idea of Oriental despotism that he had in the early 1850s and in the Communist Manifesto seems to be, it doesn't seem as pronounced.